things our great-grandparents, or depending on your age, your grandparents did better than us. So first up on that list is buying local. So back in the day, I wish this was still in effect, and maybe it is where you live, but it's certainly not for most of mainstream society, is you knew your local milkman. In fact, he delivered your milk to your door in a lot of instances in a glass bottle, and then you would return those glass bottles. Now, if you had your own milk cow, then of course it was super local to your own backyard. But you can still find local dairies in most areas. It might not be where they're actually delivering to your doorstep, but we have several grocery stores in our general vicinity, which is still like at least a 35 to 40 minute drive for me to the closest one. But it is organic, local, grass-fed, non-homogenized. So the cream rises to the top, which is the best milk. And so I get it in these glass bottles, and then I rinse out my bottle. And the next time I go back to the store, then I take them back the glass bottle and get my next thing of milk. But our great-grandparents and our grandparents really did a good job of local shopping. And that was great because you had a local economy. And right now, what we have been experiencing as a world really with the pandemic is seeing how important it is to have local sources and not be dependent upon our food and different items coming from huge manufacturers and being shipped from long distances, because that supply chain can really break down. But it wasn't always just food. So sometimes it was also like your lumber. You would go to the local sawmill and you would put in how much lumber you needed. You could go and look at the lumber and the logs and tell them the exact specs. They would cut it, and then you would come and pick up your order. Unfortunately, now a lot of our furniture and the things that we buy, they are produced in big production lines, which there's some still good quality things that you can get that way. But honestly, something that is handmade by a dedicated craftsman, you really cannot touch. It will last for years and years and generations, whereas most of the things that we get from, big manufacturer plants or commercially just is not made to last and doesn't have the same level of workmanship. So case in point, this is our dining room table, which is just a part of my kitchen. Here is my dining area. But this table, my husband made for us. So he does work at a local sawmill. They actually saw up guitar tops and bracewood for guitars. So you can see the beautiful figuring in this wood. And then the top also has this awesome live edge. So he constructed, this thing is solid. We actually had to carry it in two pieces and had to have help carrying it in, because this is a solid table that I will be able to pass down to my daughter or to my grandchildren, great-grandchildren someday. It is made to last. You can see, just in case you're curious, to see the rest of the construction down there. How that is put together. I mean, you can see with these bolts, this is not going anywhere. So other skill sets that they had were knowing how to make things last and to make do. So a new outfit, oh my goodness, that was something that you got very rarely, had a very limited wardrobe. And when something wore out or no longer fit, then that fabric was saved and put into a scrap bag to be turned into things later. So one skill set, now some people obviously still sew, but it's not something that's taught in public schools very much anymore. And it's not a skill set that everybody has, whereas back in the day, most people had some fundamental skill sets when it came to sewing. And you don't have to have a sewing machine or become a full-on seamstress to be able to do some very simple mending that can really help you with the clothes that you do have, making them last longer or even fit better. So just doing a simple straight seam and knowing how to hem can take you a long way. So I'm actually going to show you, I had some mending to do today on this shirt. So I'm just going to walk you through really simple mending skill, the first stitch my mom ever taught me, and the one that I still probably use the very most. Okay, are you ready for this? This is my sewing kit, and it's not huge and it's not robust, but it has all the essentials. And this sewing little basket that you see here, my sewing box, this was my mom's when she was a kid. So it was passed on to me, and it's still the one that I use. She passed it on to me when I think she started teaching me to sew, I was probably about 8 years old. And so this is still the same exact sewing kit that I use. So number one piece that you need to have in a sewing kit is fabric dedicated scissors. So all my sewers out there, all my quilters know that if anybody touches your sewing scissors and tries to cut paper or cardboard or anything except fabric with them, watch out for the wrath. So my kids and my husband know, do not get into my sewing kit and use my fabric scissors for anything unless you're cutting thread or fabric. Number one rule. Number one, now I also quilt, so we're going to talk about quilting, but I usually use my rotary cutter is more for when I'm doing quilting than it is for regular sewing. This is actually the pattern, which I'm going to show you a little bit on quilting, that I hand quilt. And so this was what I used to hand quilt the quilt my latest quilt, I should say, that I just finished. So of course, other things you really need to have in a sewing kit, needles are going to be number one. Need to have some needles there. And then I also have, this is my pin cushion for my pins when I'm needing, oops, actually I have a loose needle and thread there. There we go. So I will take, when I have just a little bit of thread left on a needle, so that's black, and I also have white. And this lid, which is great, has some padding in there, and so I just can put it like that. It had just gotten pulled out. And then of course you are going to need a seam ripper. This is still my best friend, especially because I'm not a seamstress. I've sewn a few items of clothing. I'm much more comfortable with mending and quilting, but a seam ripper is a good thing to have on hand. And then this is a sliding, so it allows you to measure, which is also important, especially when you're doing hems, and not hymns. I'm thinking of singing, hems, not hymns. And then the other thing that I really encourage is a thimble. So this is especially true if you're hemming things on a really thick seam and you're needing to push it through and it's thick material, and also with quilting. So this is my favorite type of thimble to use. It's leather. It's thick leather, and it just goes over your finger, and so you can just push through really easily. I prefer this to the silver metal thimbles that go on the end of your finger. This is just the one that I use for quilting, and then hence for everything else. And then of course so those are like just the basics that I recommend having in a sewing kit, and then different colors of thread. So this is actually my white quilting thread. So this is 100% cotton, and it is thicker than something I would use on really fine material, more like clothing material. It's a little bit thicker. And then of course, just whatever colors you think you're gonna have with fabric. It's really good to have your basics, which is gonna be, of course, white, maybe cream, black, gray, dark blue, kind of some of your neutral ones, and then you can get into other colors as well. So I actually have a shirt here that the sleeve, let me see which sleeve is it? I think it's the other one. The seam on the sleeve, get that up really close to the camera there for you. See there, it's starting to come, the seam is starting to separate. So if you have something that's separating on a seam, that is probably the easiest thing when it's just a straight line and it's already a seam for you to fix by hand. So I'm gonna pull this inside out, and you just are gonna take both sides of the material here, and you're going to measure them back so that they meet really easy and evenly. Now, this is such a small seam that's just starting to come undone. That's maybe a 1/2 inch really, that I don't even need to pin that. But I do need to match up my thread. So I have got some purple thread, purple shirt, gets the job done. And I'm not actually gonna need very much thread at all because like I said, this is a pretty small spot where the seam is just starting to become unraveled. It's less than 1/2 inch. So first up, I thread, is the camera gonna pick that up? It's super duper tiny. But thread my needle. So just put that thread through the eye. You want to have a little bit of excess hanging here so that when you're pulling through, it doesn't pull immediately through the eye of the needle. And then I really don't need very much, but I'm just gonna cut it to about there. Then next step is we need a knot. So this is the way my mom taught me when I was little, and it's still the exact same way that I do it, to put a knot in the end of your thread. And that is, my hands are washed, okay? Get your finger wet, and you're gonna wrap it. You're gonna take this thread right here. You're gonna wrap it around, so it's in a circle around the end of your finger, and then you roll it back and forth, and then you take your fingers and you pull that down, and you'll get a knot. Sometimes on the first go around, especially as I'm trying to do this as demonstration format, I've never actually done this in video, you have to do it a couple of times, and then you'll get a knot on the second or maybe the third time. I need to probably roll it a little bit more and get a little bit more tinge friction there. There we go. So now I have a knot. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. I have a knot on the end of my thread. And this is going to be on, that's why we turn it inside out, right? And this is really thin material, so I don't need to even bother with my thimble. But we're gonna start, and I always start, so this is where the fabric has separated. So I'm going to start a little bit back behind there to catch it, not right where it has separated at, but a little bit further behind there where it's still got a good seam. And so you're just gonna take, I think I'm gonna flip my camera around. Okay, so I got you up closer here so you can see the seam. So this is where it has become separated, right here. So I'm going to actually start a little bit further back, and you can see where the original seam, this thread, so I'm going to follow that exact same line. So I'm going to insert my needle right where that original seam is, and then you're going to pull that through. So make sure my knot is holding, which it absolutely is. And then for just doing a straight seam like this is the easiest way to do it by hand. And you're gonna come over, so I have, my thread is now on the back side from the camera. You're gonna come back over to the front, and you're gonna insert it just a little bit on the other side, still keeping it at the same depth of the seam. And then you're just going to pull that. So you're gonna actually have thread that is gonna be over top of the seam there. And then same thing, you're just gonna pull that through. We're just gonna go all the way along. And I usually probably have about 1/8 of an inch between, probably not even 1/8. I have about 1/16 of an inch, if we're gonna be exact with our measurements, between each point where I'm putting the needle back in and pulling it through. So I've gotten to the edge of my fabric there. Now I need to tie off a knot. So I'm going to come here, and we're gonna grab a little bit of the fabric with my needle. So I'm gonna go in and then up. So in and up. And then I'm going to pull this till I've got a little bit of circle with the thread there. And then you're gonna put your needle through that and pull it tight. Okay, so I'm gonna do that one more time. Get that there. A little bit of a circle, needle goes through, pull it tight, and that secures my stitches and my thread. Snip that off. And then we're gonna pull this right side out now so you can see my mending job. So now, see, all better. You can't even tell where I stitched it and where it was stitched from the factory. So that's a really easy way. Like I said, if it's something as just a seam coming unraveled, doing a straight like that is probably one of the easiest beginner stitchers and easiest things for you to mend. And so now that's going to hold really, really well. So now you know how to mend a shirt sleeve if you didn't before. Okay. So like I said, one thing our great-grandparents did really good is they held onto and reused material. So if somebody outgrew something or part of it become wore out, they would save some of the fabric and they would have a scrap bag of fabric. Now, sometimes if it was like a larger piece of clothing, like a sheet or something that an adult had worn, there would be enough salvageable good fabric that was still in good shape on that to cut that down and to make it into something for a child or an infant or a toddler, right? Someone smaller, and just cut out the really worn pieces of the fabric. And if that wasn't a possibility, then they would just save the good parts of the fabric. Some they could just use as rags, obviously. They didn't buy paper towels. They would use them for rags, but you would save the other pieces of the fabric and definitely the buttons. Did anybody else have a grandma or a mom? Let me know in the comments below if you did, who had a button box. So today's clothes, the majority of, we don't have as many buttons on our clothes as we did back in the day. Or I don't think at least most people don't. I don't have buttons on today except for the buttons on my jeans. But a lot of times things were made with buttons. So men's shirts were with buttons. They didn't wear t-shirts as much. It was, you know, maybe an undershirt, but a lot of them were long sleeve shirts with buttons, and they would be button up or even short sleeve, but they were button up shirts. But buttons were expensive, and so you never threw away those buttons. You always saved the button, and they would have a button box of all different buttons throughout the years from different things of clothing that they could, you know, use to resew things later. Or if a button popped off of a shirt, obviously, and it got lost or something, then they had a button box to go to instead of buying buttons. But this is one of my boxes of fabric. It's also, I have some quilting patterns because I mentioned I love quilting, and quilting was a skill set that a lot of people had back in the day because you could take a lot of this scrap fabric that wasn't enough to put into a full-on garment, but it was enough to make quilts out of. And so that's where a lot of our quilts, scrap quilts and quilting and blankets were made from. So some of this fabric I had bought new. This I bought new and made. This quilt is the last quilt that I made. Here behind me. And so some of the pieces in here were just odd and end pieces of fabric that I have been collecting. I started quilting when I was 8. My grandma quilted and my mom quilted, and my grandma had one of the big quilt frames that would hang from the ceiling, and I wanted to quilt. And so they taught me how to quilt, and I had a family friend who actually took me fabric shopping at 8 years old, and I got to pick out fabric. And no joke, I am now 39 and I still have some of that fabric. So as long as it is kept in a dry, good environment where like dry rot doesn't set in or mildew, fabric will actually last surprisingly for quite a while. And so let me see if I can find any of the original. So this is some of the fabric that I got when I first started quilting. And that is this piece right, see, and you can see that they're just coordinating colors there. Those were some of the original ones. But on a lot of this stuff, there's not really enough of it left to make a full quilt of anything, barely, like on this piece. And so I had some different odd and end pieces here, and you can see that's kind of like the gold and this pink and this green and this yellow. But I knew that I didn't really want just that in a quilt. So I did buy new this material here. And I have a few strips, which of course I'm saving because I can use this in a different quilt somewhere else at another time. I bought this fabric because it kind of tied all of those colors together and made this quilt. So let me take you out there. So this is the quilt that I made. So it has that large border piece on it. And then this squares in the center. But the funny thing was, until I got it finished, I didn't really realize that these blues and the pinks and the gold, they kind of resemble a little bit like a baby blanket. So anyways, this is one that I put out in the spring and the summer. It's more lightweight. It just has a solid backing and it's very, very light batting inside. So this isn't a super heavy thick quilt. So it's just a throw quilt that I set out. It's like a lap quilt. So it just kind of goes over your lap. It's not for a bed, that I put out in the spring and summer months. So I'm a little bit late actually pulling this out. But with the quilting, I did use my sewing machine to stitch together the top. So because these were squares into strips and then straight lines, it was very easy straight lines to use a sewing machine for. So I did do that, but I am a hand quilter. I've never quilted by machine, only by hand. And so I'm gonna see if the camera will get this close enough, but in between on these white squares here, this is what I pinned to it and then quilted around. So there's actually a little flower pattern, and that's part of the hand quilting that I did on all of this. So I just save my patterns when I copy and cut them out that I use, and then I can pin and reuse this later as another pattern on the next quilt, which I don't know which pattern I'm going to do next. I think I'm going to attempt to do a larger quilt and do a queen size for our bed, but I haven't decided yet what that's going to be. But this brings me to the point of having those skill sets. So sewing and then things like quilting, which allowed them to reuse a lot of material from different clothing stuff that would just have been worn out. They would also take the rags if they weren't making quilts, and you would make rag rugs for your floor. So lots of different things, but they really knew how to reuse items instead of just getting rid of them and donating them, I think much better than we do as a society today. So another skill set that they had, which is probably not going to come as a big surprise, but that would be cooking and baking from scratch. So that's something that a lot of us are getting back to doing, especially now that the availability to go to stores has been impacted, supplies that stores have has been impacted, but having baked goods and of course the pantry with the items to do it. You can check out some other videos where I have got 15 items to always keep stocked in your pantry and walk you through my pantry and what we keep. But cooking and baking from scratch was a big thing. There were not, or most of them did not use convenience items like we're used to today. So case in point. So here is my chocolate sourdough bread, which I have a video on, and the recipe is up on the website. So I'll have a link below there. You can catch that out if you want to print that out and make this. But what I wanted to show you is instead of using plastic wrap, I use my glass dome. So this actually, I have like the big pedestal. It's like a cake stand that this will fit on. But when I have things like muffins or sweetbreads like that, I just put them on my dinner plate and then put this on. And this will keep really well without drying out for about 4 to 5 days. So I usually will batch cook what we're having. This is breakfast right now. Quick breakfast or snacks for the kids during the week. So I'll batch up and make a big batch of everything on Sundays. And then this takes us through the week, usually until at least Thursday, sometimes Friday, and store it just like this with this glass dome on it. Works really well. So no need for plastic wrap or tinfoil or any of those things. But another thing when it comes to from scratch baking, join me this way. And that is sourdough starter. Actually, this is leftover whey because I made cheese on Saturday. And this is leftover whey that I'm not going to be using because there's not really enough of it to make ricotta. So this is actually going out to the pigs, which we brought home yesterday. So this will be part of the pig's feed. But that is using all the parts. And I actually need to, I did not on Sunday in my baking make any sourdough bread. So we're getting low on bread. And so I need to build my starter up enough in order to make bread. So no store-bought yeast needed. And I'm actually just gonna build up for this round. I'm gonna do a half a cup of all-purpose flour, and then I'll feed this again tonight with some fresh ground flour. I'm doing a mixed loaf right now. So get my flour in there. So I don't usually weigh my starter when I'm just getting it ready to make more bread. So I usually will do, as I said, half cup flour, and then I'll just start with a 1/4 cup of water. I usually do more of the weighing when I actually am making the bread dough up. And I'm just starting to build up my starter. I had it asleep in the fridge because I haven't used it since last week. And that way I don't have to feed it every day and go through as much flour when it's an active mature starter, which mine is. This is, I think the starter is like 8 years old. So at this point, I'm just doing enough water to fully incorporate the flour. And so that was right on the money. And so I'm going to let this ferment and rise and get built back up in strength. I'll feed it a little bit more tonight, and then I will bake bread with it tomorrow. But this is definitely a skill set that our great-grandparents had. Wash the flour off. And of course, our great grandparents and grandparents were a lot more self-sufficient than I would say society as a whole is. Now, if you're in a modern homesteading like I am, and you are a follower of mine, then you probably are more self-sufficient than most of modern society. But having a garden, preserving your own food and putting it up, etc. And which makes this next point that I feel that they did better than us perhaps seem a little bit contradictory when you think of someone being self-sufficient. But they were really good at helping one another out. You didn't have any sugar, you would run over to the neighbors and borrow a cup of sugar. Or they had barn raisings like really far back in the day, but you would have communities that would come together and they would help each other. I actually feel really fortunate the community that I live in. We had some neighbors whose home burnt down and the community came together in a huge way and donated money and funds and things to them to help them, through that time. But even small scale, we have an abundance of rhubarb right now. And so I baked up and took over a rhubarb dessert to one of our neighbors as a thank you for some things that they had done for us. And so just knowing and cultivating good will within your community and within your neighbors, not being afraid to reach out, or if you grow extra, give it to them and facilitate that back and forth, so that when hard times come, you can lean on one another and help one another and support one another. And I think that's something that during these times that we all could really take note of and probably do a little bit better. You may already be doing a great job of that, but I know that no matter where our skill sets lie, that there's always an area that we can improve upon and learn to do more. So as you saw, I have that way there. Cheese making is a skill set that I've done some of, but I haven't done a lot of the aged and hard cheeses. I've done soft cheeses. And so that is something that I'm diving into right now and really excited about to add to my skill set. So I would love to know what you're working on or what you're wanting to learn about and do next within your skill set. And if there's anything that I missed, or that you think is something else that our great-grandparents or grandparents did really well in a society we should look at bringing more back in, please do let me know in the comments below. And as I said, all the different recipes, learning how to make a sourdough starter, that chocolate sourdough bread, some of those different things, I will pop links to those recipes and tutorials and stuff below this video so that you can go and check them out. Okay, bye for now.